The life of a refugee is rarely simple, even more so recently with developments in the United States, where the current administration has removed protections to various groups which were granted safe haven there in the past. Here in Canada, too, the risk of deportation looms large, as the ongoing case of Nova Scotia's Abdoul Abdi demonstrates. Joining us now for more, Andrew Brower. He is Vice President of the Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers. Audrey Macklin, Professor and Chair in Human Rights Law at the University of Toronto. And Vicky Mochama, national columnist for Metro News Canada. And we are delighted to have the three of you here with us at TVO this evening. Let's just get some basics on the table. Audrey, I'll go to you first on this to make sure we understand the discussion to come. The Temporary Protected Status Program in the U.S., what is that?
It's a mechanism by which the United States can designate an entire group from a particular country as needing temporary protection from removal from the United States. It comes with certain kinds of entitlements, for example, the entitlement to work. What it doesn't do is confer a permanent status of refugee on these individuals from this country, which in turn enables them to get permanent residence and ultimately citizenship. So it happens more expeditiously, it happens on a group basis, but it is less secure.
And presumably it's happening because something in their country of origin is horrific and therefore prevents them from returning.
Absolutely. Okay. And so it's a kind of group determination that is, in a sense, a more efficient way of recognizing that there is a problem of a certain magnitude that makes it unjust and indeed impossible to return people there.
Having said that, the President of the United States recently made some changes to that program. Can you fill us in on those?
Yeah, he has announced that he's going to cancel a number of the categories of temporary protected status. So he's already canceled it, or it will be ending within a number of months for Haiti, as well as for Nicaragua, I believe. And he has announced El Salvador, which is by far the largest group of TPS beneficiaries, will also be losing their status. There are about
ramifications of which are what?
Massive. There are about 200,000 El Salvadorans who are benefiting currently from the TPS program. It's been estimated that they have at least another 200,000 children who are U.S. citizens. All of those folks, well, at least the parents, the TPS beneficiaries, are facing potential deportation back to El Salvador.
Potential deportation.
Potential deportation.
It's not a fait accompli.
Not yet. We need to see whether anything changes. There's still Congress. There's still the possibility that Congress would step up and provide some sort of a path to status. But we know that President Trump was making some pretty negative comments about these groups of folks just yesterday. So whether or not he will agree to something like that is up in the air.
That's a delicate way of portraying what the president in fact said.
Indeed, I'd be happy for you to say it on camera,
I'm not gonna, and we can't say it on a family program. Vicky, I wonder if you could tell us how Canada responded to the cancellation, because you did mention Haiti as one of the countries. The temporary program for Haitians, what was the reaction here?
The reaction here has more or less to maintain a level of the status quo. There's been an increase in Canada's presence at the borders, and so that's sort of been a reactive response to be in some way prepared for refugees who would walk across the border in a regular fashion. But in terms of actually, any sort of statement saying, that we would transfer that particular protection to Canada, there has not been that kind of a response. And so in Canada, we're waiting to see what it is this government will do when it comes to temporary protected status and some of the other types of citizenship changes or changes to the refugee system that the United States is making.
If the U.S. has, in effect, closed a door, do you think Canada should open that door?
I think the door has been opened. I think people have been coming through it. I think since last year, when the President of the United States came in, many people have chosen to make the choice, they've read the tea leaves of what this particular administration of the United States is saying and doing, and they've chosen to walk across the border. So I don't know if it's a matter of opening the door, but ensuring that there's actually a home for them here.
Understood. Let's bring this up, shall we? This is how the Canadian press reported this just a few days ago. Asylum claims from Salvadorans have been on the rise. Data from the IRB, that's the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada, shows that 244 refugee claims were lodged in Canada by Salvadorans in all of 2016. Now, between January and September of 2017, there were 564, twice as much, in other words. In addition, to preparations at the border itself, the federal government has launched a campaign in the U.S. to try to stop people from coming in the first place. Some of the asylum seekers were spurred north by a misconception that Canada has special immigration programs in place for people covered by the temporary status program in the U.S. This seems to put a level of confusion around the whole thing. Would you agree?
Yes. Canada doesn't have anything like temporary protected status. It has what we call an asylum system or a refugee protection system. So that means that, in fact, it is a process by which people can ask for refugee protection, be heard before the Immigration and Refugee Board. If they succeed, then they get refugee protection and they are on a path to permanent residence. If they do not succeed and they exhaust available recourses, then they're liable to removal. So it has the advantages of a refugee protection system, which is to say that it provides a security that TPS does not. It has the disadvantage of our refugee protection system, as with all other refugee protection systems in the world, that it is under-resourced, slow, and therefore liable to the buildup of backlogs and delays.
Would it be useful, Andrew, to refugees if we had an extra option, namely a temporary refugee program, as they do in the United States, although not for all the groups that were previously covered?
Yeah, having additional paths to security for folks would be a good thing. Of course, the refugee program in Canada is built on the idea that once you come here and you get refugee protection, you're a member of our community and you will stay here for good. And I think that's important. That's part of what makes Canada Canada. It's part of our society. So I certainly wouldn't want to see a shift to this temporary situation that they have in the U.S. And many of the beneficiaries of TPS are living right now in this horrific situation where they face this great uncertainty about whether they're going to be able to remain. So that's not something I would say Canada should be copying. Expanding programs to allow people to remain in Canada where they have fled environmental disasters, or civil wars where they may not meet the refugee definition but still shouldn't be forced to go back, that's a good thing. Expanding those kinds of programs, we would strongly support.
Did you want to add something to that?
No, I agree. I think temporariness is a really difficult situation for people to endure. And know that some of the people who are under so-called temporary protection status have been living in the United States for 15 years, longer. They have children born in the United States. And what that means is that if the parents are removed, the children either are going to be accompanying the parents to a country they've never been to, or they are going to be stranded, potentially abandoned in the United States. That can't be good for the United States either.
That raises the whole DACA issue, right? The deferred arrivals, which has been so much in the news in the United States lately.
Well, children born in the United States aren't subject to DACA. They're citizens of the United States.
Yes.
But children who arrive at a very young age are indeed those who are subject to
okay.
DACA.
Nice segue here. Thank you for that, because one of the reasons we're talking about this subject tonight on this program is not just because of what's going on in the United States, but Vicki, I'll bring you in at this point. We have our own sort of made in Canada example of this. Abdoul Abdi is a guy who lives in Nova Scotia. He moved there when he was 6 years old. Pick up the story. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so Abdoul Abdi and his family fled Somalia when he was really, really young, and they arrived in Canada as refugees when he was 6 years old. At that time, his mother had passed away, and his aunt had taken primary guardianship of him. Shortly after they arrive here, he is removed from her guardianship by Nova Scotia Child Welfare, as well as his sister, who's also removed. And over the next decade plus, he has shifted between about 31 different homes. He has several encounters with police, because that's what happens when you're in the child welfare system. The state is your mom and the police is your father. And so this results in him having far more contact with police than the average Canadian child should have. But basically, at no point does Nova Scotia Child Welfare apply for citizenship for him and his sister.
So they dropped that ball.
They dropped that particular ball. His aunt, who considers herself his mom, she tries to both get the children back and is able to eventually get a sister back and able to get citizenship for the sister. However, Nova Scotia Child Welfare prevents her at every single turn from obtaining citizenship for Abdoul. And so he grows up thinking that he exists in Canada and everything's fine. But when upon being arrested, he finds out that he's at risk of deportation. And that's where he currently is, risking, he faces a serious deportation challenge with the Canadian government because he's not a Canadian citizen. Canadian citizen, but he has only ever known Canada as far as he's concerned, and so there's a chance that he may be deported to Saudi Arabia because that is a country that they stayed in. The other option is Somalia, and we wouldn't the CBSA has said that we would not deport him to Somalia.
Canadian Border Services.
Yes, yes. So that's the challenge at present. And so the question is whether or not Nova Scotia Child and Welfare Services abdication of their responsibility to protect this child creates a responsibility on the part of the Canadian government to finally provide him that protection.
Well, certainly there's lots of people in Nova Scotia who think so because, and again, many people will have heard of this story because of a question asked by his sister, at the town hall that Prime Minister Trudeau did in Sackville, New Brunswick. And let's bring this graphic up here. Here is some of what was asked on that occasion. This was asked by the Halifax activist and poet L. Jones. He was abused in Canada. He was taken into care in Canada. The neglect he experienced happened in Canada. And now Canada wants to say he's this danger and should be kicked out. The only reason why he's vulnerable to this is because he was failed by Canada. The people that were supposed to take care of him, if he's deported, the likelihood is he will die. Do we have a death sentence in Canada for assault? It's just wrong. Activist and poet L. Jones, as quoted, I think, in your paper, actually. Okay, where do we want to go here from this? How likely is it, Andrew, come on in here. How likely is it, given that this man's story is now public, given that the Prime Minister now knows about it, although he would not speak directly to what he could do personally for Abdi in this case, citing privacy restrictions, how likely is it that enough pressure will be brought to bear by others to find, I guess, what you would consider to be a happy ending for this story?
Right. Well, I'm hopeful. I'm certainly always hopeful that the government is going to listen. I think that this case raises a really serious systemic problem with Canada's deportation policy and program. And with this whole concept of sort of double punishment, the idea that if you don't happen to have a piece of paper saying you're a Canadian citizen, even if you've lived here your entire life, apart from the place of birth, that you can be not just someone who goes through the criminal justice system, serves their time, but when you walk out of jail, unlike the Canadian citizen who gets to go home, you get stuck on a plane and taken away from everything you know. I think this case really highlights that fundamental problem that we have in Canada, this distinction between citizens and non-citizens, when in fact many of those non-citizens are members of our community just as much as everyone around this table.
Audrey.
And I think it's important to emphasize here that the point is not that no non-citizens should ever be deported. What we're talking about here are people who are effectively products of Canadian society. They may have gotten into trouble, they may have difficulties, but they are made in Canada. And we cannot shirk our responsibility toward them by sending them to a place where, in this circumstance, he's never even set foot in his entire life. Not to mention the fact that Somalia is a place so dangerous that Canadian officials themselves are barred from going there. Saudi Arabia, the country where he was born, absolutely will not recognize him as a citizen, and I would be very surprised if they would even contemplate receiving him.
We do need, and Vicki, I'll put this to you, we do need to say for the record, he was convicted of aggravated assault and assaulting a police officer. That's not a good thing. Mm-hmm. And acknowledging all of what you put on the record about his very troubled background and, 31 different
homes in a decade period.
Okay. The fact that he was convicted, not of minor shoplifting from a corner store, but aggravated assault and assaulting a cop, that's problematic, isn't it?
Absolutely, but we have to acknowledge that in our system, if you have served your time, you cannot continue to be punished for that crime into perpetuity. And so he actually has served his time. When he was detained by the Canadian Border Services, he was being released into a halfway house in Toronto. And so at that point, he had served the time for the crime for which he was punished. We do not have an endless punitive system. And so I think it's fair to say that the crime was heinous, but he has acknowledged that that's not, having now had to risk his citizenship and his access to his family, he fully acknowledges that crime was incredibly violent and terribly unfair, but that doesn't mean he should be deported to a country where he risks death.
That's right. He's not someone who stepped off a plane and assaulted an officer at the airport at Pearson. He's someone who's been here his entire life. So there's really no, in terms of fairness, there's no reason why we would treat him any differently from a Canadian citizen committing the same heinous crime.
Just to underscore that, the question is not whether he is a model member of the community, it's whether he's a member of the community. And having decided, understanding that he is, that's what makes it unjust to remove him.
So how should this end, in your view?
This should end with him not being deported and eventually, well, being secure against deportation and having access to citizenship. But whether or not he ever becomes a citizen, the point is he is, in a functional sense, a product of Canada, a member of this community, and therefore cannot be forcibly removed. I should say that there is a precedent. The United Nations Human Rights Committee considered a complaint against Canada several years ago from a man named Warsami, whose situation was very similar to this. And the UN Human Rights Committee decided that Canada was in breach of its international human rights obligations by deporting Warsami from Canada, which was, under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Warsami's own country. By deporting a man from his own country, Canada breached its voluntarily undertaken human rights obligations and, was in breach. Having found that, the then Canadian government just decided to deport Warsami anyway, in breach of its international legal obligations.
Despite what I assume was a legal team that went to bat for him anyway.
Absolutely.
And it still happened.
Absolutely.
Counselor, I'm going to ask you a question that is not meant to be a leading question. This is a neutral, open-ended question, okay? We saw a picture of Mr. Abdi a second ago. He's a person of color. Mm-hmm. Does race matter in these issues?
Of course, race matters. Race is directly implicated in the entire criminal and immigration system, for sure. It colors everything, pardon the pun, but it colors everything that happens.
Now, you're saying that because you think that, but do you know that?
Of course we know that. If we look at who is incarcerated, for example, just within the criminal justice system, it's clear that we know that it's racialized communities who are populating Canada's jails. Likewise, in the deportation regime, particularly in cases like Mr. Abdi's, where it's the deportation of someone in this particular danger opinion process, within my practice, in almost every case, people are going back to Africa.
So if, I hate to take the Trump example here, but if this guy were white from Norway, we wouldn't be having this conversation?
Well, yeah, I don't know whether we'd have this conversation. I think that the odds of ending up in the situation, going through the kinds of marginalized lives that some of these kids have faced would be different. I think they might have had better access to better options and support when they were kids as they were growing up, and maybe wouldn't have ended up in this criminal system.
What's your view on whether race is at play here?
I think race is definitely at play here. I think it's important to talk about probabilities and likelihood. A young white man who comes from Norway has in all the touch points that Mr. Abdi faced, has a far greater likelihood of a positive outcome. And so at every single step during the child welfare process, Black families report being criminalized and pathologized and having their kids taken away, from little things to, a child welfare worker decides that the culturally appropriate food that's in the house is not sufficient, and on that basis decides to remove a child. To anything amounting to neglect, feeling that an immigrant family who's sharing a smaller apartment, that's not enough space for a child, and that's the basis by which they take away a child. And so these are the touch points at which Black families report regular and systemic problems. And a lot of it having to do with race, a lot of it having to do with, a child welfare system that's often heavily staffed by white workers who don't understand some of the cultural nuances, but also a system that has traditionally been used to remove Black children and Indigenous children as well from their families. And so there is a racialized system at work in child welfare, and for immigrant families who have to encounter this system, it is another way in which race factors in.
In which case, what could be done, Audrey, to make the system less racist?
Well, if we're talking about the immigration system being less racist, I think it's important to keep in mind that it has always and everywhere been racialized. So immigration is often conceived of as being part of a project of building the nation and deciding who can join the nation. And there is no doubt that historically and up to the present, the idea of who was idealized as a potential member of the nation is color-coded. And if there is any doubt about the persistence of that, one only has to reference President Trump's recent racist remarks. So I think both coming to terms with that, acknowledging it, and also understanding that there is inevitably going to be a correlation between racialization and socioeconomic impacts of that. It's no coincidence that countries that are predominantly racialized are also those that have socioeconomic conditions that are less favorable, and that's a legacy of a kind of global colonization project that has had that impact. So they are linked. It is no answer to say, this is not about race or racialization. It's about socioeconomics. Mm-hmm. Those two are inextricably bound.
Andrew, in our last 30 seconds here, you've done many of these cases. Mm-hmm. Mr. Abdi's case, what's the likelihood that it's going to turn out the way you want it to?
Well, there's the fact that this case is now on the radar of the Prime Minister, that does allow the option, at least, for some direct political intervention.
Can he intervene?
Absolutely, he can intervene. The Minister can intervene for sure. There are lots of moments where this can be taken off the current track.
I think it's important to note that everything that's happening with and to Mr. Abdi is happening at the behest of the government. CBSA is acting under the Minister's orders, and so it's up to him to withdraw them as well.
They absolutely can do that. And I think going forward, it's important that we have a policy that says people who arrive as children and have lived in Canada more or less continuously for some number of years should be protected from removal. That this not be left to discretion at the last minute, at the 11th hour, in desperate circumstances that depend on one's ability to attract media attention. I think there needs to be an affirmative policy going forward that grapples with this.
Gotcha. Good of all three of you to come into TVO tonight and help us out with this. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.